Hey, Composing Gloves here, and today we're going to be talking about operators, specifically the functions of the wave morphing capabilities in the operators. So we know that in Sytrus we have 6 of these things. They're all outputting an individual waveform. This is one cycle, represents one cycle of our waveform. And Sytrus is super mega cool because it gives us a very exact control, like extensive control over this. Much more than most VSTs. This may be the most extensive control I've ever seen as far as being able to control a single cycle with exact accuracy this intuitively, because I'm a big Harmor guy too, and Harmor lets you do some pretty wild things, but I feel like this just has a leg up on the intuitiveness because they've got 6 voices that you can very deliberately control. So we've learned how to route these out individually and sort of a little bit about the routing with FM and where we can go. Now we need to learn about, our sources. What can we do with that? And you'll notice that a lot of patches use just the operator waveform capabilities, and then they just filter and affect it from there. They don't even use the rest of the plugin. It's kind of crazy how much you can do. So we're just going to look at one operator. They're the same for all 6. So once you look at one, you are done. We have, if you hover over these sliders, you can see what they control up here. And we are going to look first at, so here is a picture of our waveform. If you come to the oscillator tab, if you come down here, we have all these different options. We see a huge representation, and this gives us a lot more options. We're not going to look at this tab yet because it's pretty extensive. We're going to look at just this. So we have our view here, and I'm just using this so we can get a bigger view of what's going on. If you right click, you can select square, saw, triangle, or sine. So like we're at a sine wave, and let's go to a triangle wave. Boom. And you see it moves the shape tool. So this shape tool moves between sine wave, triangle, saw, square, and pulse. So that's really nifty. Now, if we click, let's say we want to go to a saw. Let's say saw. We can go to square. You see it does not have pulse on the list. If you do that, we have one more option here. We have convert to sine harmonics. So if you click that, bang, it'll show us the phase and amplitude relationship of the individual harmonics in here. Now, this only has 128 harmonics, so it's not the complete signal, because the complete signal theoretically should have an infinite series, but it's detailed. Like, this is it. It's an additive process that we're using here. So really, really nifty relationship. So we can quickly see, and we can manipulate things in this window, but we're not going to talk about it because this is usually pretty sufficient for a lot of tasks. So we need a triangle wave. We can also scroll through here and change some stuff. Once you've converted it to sine harmonics, we've sort of committed to a few individual different things. So I'm going to leave it at a sine wave, and it will behave regularly again. So we come here and we have these 3 options here that allow us to do unusual things to our waveform. If we get a more complicated waveform, we can really get pretty exact with how things are moving. What does this do? Well, this takes it says, hey, we only want positive values. Essentially, that's what it's doing. If you look up here, it'll say half. So it'll take half of your waveform, the positive side, and it will put it up there. If you had an oscillation beforehand and you did half, it'll just put it up there. So it'll put it up there. That's what I'm saying. So it'll give you all the positive values. So yeah, that's what it sounds like. That's what it looks like. It's essentially a type of DC offset. So, okay, what's this one do? Well, this one does even. It'll basically take your waveform and squish it into half the time, and then leave a 0 value for the other half. And that could be nifty for a variety of different textures and timbres. And finally, you have it where it just flips the negative side of the positive. And you can see that essentially, you can see this disables that if we have them both on. That essentially just increases the pitch, because now you have 2 oscillations in the time of 1. This can become much more complicated when you have something like this going on. As you can see, with a more complex waveform, we get a more complex result when we do things like that. Now, this has to do with higher harmonics and just really familiarizing yourself with the different waveform structures. They're covered in my SoundSynth Basics if you're curious about that. This is technically a type of DC offset. It's interesting in the way because it's a really deliberate, consistent, calculated thing. But yeah, so moving on. So we have our shape knob. We've already talked about this. If you manipulate your oscillator tab, your shape knob, again, will behave very differently. It may not do these knobs and controls will do different things. So you may want to be careful when working in Sytrus at what point you begin to manipulate stuff down here. You can always reset it by simply clicking and selecting one of the basic shapes, and it will kind of re-evaluate everything for you. But if you convert it to sine harmonics and you do things, you could get some wonky relationships. Like you can see here, that did not happen before. So go to sine wave. So again, start moving in here and weird crap starts to happen. Whoops. And so I'm going to go back to my sine wave. Okay. So we have tension. Tension simply is that. It basically takes values that as they approach 0 and it pushes them closer to the maximum and minimum. So you go, oh, or we could do the inverse and take them and push them to 0 instead of to the max and minimum. This is now, I will say this is adding higher frequency content, but it adds it dynamically. You may understand this, but you may not have consciously made this connection, which is whenever you play a sine wave wants to go on forever. It says, dude, man, bro, I need to play forever. And if you ever stop a sine wave, you've actually heard higher frequency content if you ever change the volume, because in order for it to change the volume, that means you're manipulating the wavelength that it's moving at. The amplitude has to change in a way that's not in perfect sync with the sine wave. If this is all going over your head, don't worry too much about it. But for those of you that are at this level, so by just changing the volume, you've added high frequency content because it's now oscillating at a rate because you were deliberately changing the amplitude that was not originally there. You may be adding really low frequency content by the way you change it. So if you do sudden value changes, you're going to add high stuff. So when you're doing this, what's cool about the tension knob is you're adding higher and lower frequency content. You're pushing values towards something and away from something, but you're adding it dynamically. It's very intuitive in the way you're adding these because it also includes phase relationships and it also includes amplitude relationships. So that's really, really nifty the way it maps these using this algorithm. So that's tension. We have skew. Skew will sort of squish it and pull it apart. It's similar to what Massive's wavetables do on some of them. So skew it. You cannot automate these. I wish you could, but you can't. There's a variety of ways to accomplish similar things using different distortion plugins and stuff. But again, one day Sytrus is going to have a mega upgrade. They'll include an EQ that's separate from the oscillator, because you could theoretically use this as an EQ, but they'll include an EQ in each operator, and they will include fully automatable grid in this. That day when that comes, man, I'm going to throw a FM party. So finally, we have the sine shaper. The sine shaper uses a transform. It uses a math equation to generate this. I'm not sure what they use, what kind of transform. There's lots of different kinds. If I knew my transforms math equations better, I could tell you, but chances are it wouldn't matter very much to you. I'm not a fan of not knowing, though. It'd be cool if there's more information on this. And if I just knew more math, I could probably tell you. But it'll apply transform. As you can see, it will generally induce additional harmonics, and it will also give you some sort of an amplitude distortion relationship. So you'll get max and min, and you'll get more harmonics as you do this. As you see, you can sort of see the harmonics being added, but then you see it applies a skew. So it's like a harmonic plus a skew thing going on here. It's as specific as I can really get. This is one of those knobs that I will reach over and touch and move, and I have an idea that that's going to happen, but with higher frequency stuff, higher ratios, complex, when I have a complex thing before me, it's sort of a touch it and see if my ear likes it. But I also have an idea of what it's going to do before I touch it, so I know if it's going to be a knob I want to touch in the first place. Finally, we have a filter. It's a pre-filter. So if we have say a saw wave, I can filter it back down to, now I can't filter it all the way to a sine wave because this is down to a single waveform, so it's kind of independent frequency-wise. I don't understand why you can't go all the way down, but you can see it start to go down. So this could be very useful if you are, now you can't automate this, which is something that, like, this is something I'd want to automate. You may consider just using an external filter for this. There may be a reason. I haven't really found one for myself, but there may be one for using this knob. Finally, on the last bit, let's go back to the sine wave. We have noise capability, so we can add noise. This is super useful, especially in modulators and other things. However, you can pretty much accomplish noise through a variety of ways using just FM. but you can add noise, very useful for percussion attacks and things like that. So that's really great. That's the waveform capabilities. So once we got our waveform capabilities going, okay, oh man, I can be really specific and add my stuff. We're going to get even more specific with the oscillator tab one day. So we generally want this up, and again, you can right click to reset things. So what do these things over here do? What are all of these knobs all about? Well, we have center. So let's say we DC offset our signal. That's not necessarily good for our headroom. And what center will do is it'll take all our sample points, calculate the average, and recenter the average at 0. So in essence, it does that, but you'll see it has to click down. So you'll get sort of a pop at the beginning, but it will move it back to the center, which can be a thing. This also may do something that you don't want. So be aware of that. This can also be bad for your speakers if you are going nuts with this. So be careful with DC offset. Okay, so that's what center does. We have D-click. So we notice that if let's go to a saw wave. It's got sort of a click at the beginning. If I go to a sine wave, we got a sort of a little click at the beginning. That's because of the high frequency content being added from the rapid volume change. And so our computer, I'm not sure how this system deals with it, because there's a load of other things that can play a role in how this is interpreted from the DSP standpoint, but there's a load of other things on the way to your speaker that can play a role, as the converters, the reconstruction filters, all that kind of jazz. So what do we do? Because it's a really fast click. Well, they have a thing called the declicking option. And you see it disappears. This may be desirable. It may not be desirable. Maybe you like the click. This is basically a super tiny fade in. They say it's some sort of special filter. All volume controls are essentially special kinds of filters. So it's pretty much that. Now we have this last option. This is where it will only come in handy in very specific situations. I'll give you one. So let's say this is 44. Let's say we're modulating it by using FM. Again, my FM series, if you want to know. We have 60, 64. Now, I assume that you've watched my digital audio series and my sound synth basics, like I keep saying, because that's stuff that you just simply have to know if you're going to be doing sound design. You need to know about aliasing and things like that, because they can be introduced in stages. So if you don't know about aliasing, you're not going to get this, but I have a series that explains it. So no excuses, man. All right, so right now in sound design, I'm going to get a lot of aliasing just from the FM from such a high ratio. And I have two ways I can solve this problem. And this one, there's one way. So if I play my signal. All right, so now if I play some notes, I've got that going on. Now what happens if I turn on band limit? Well, I'm getting aliasing first off. So this upper stuff is just going to be really loud. Not necessarily the true tone of my signal. Now this is something where you could deal with this in two ways. Three ways. You can just work with aliasing, and it could be part of your tone, in which case you'd want to turn rendering oversampling off completely. Another way is you can work with oversampling on, and then maybe once you achieve your tone, you can turn it down and set your render setting for the same stuff. That way you get the same patch that you heard. Because, all right, so here's it without oversampling. Here's it with oversampling. Quite a different tone, if you ask me. All right, but this is very, very CPU intensive. So they said, hey, why don't we, so this is all digital audio stuff again. So watch that series. Now, the aliasing can also be dealt with simply by band limiting our signal. So we can band limit our output signal, and it will make a very minor difference. I'm not sure what kind of band limit this is. I'm not sure how they're limiting it. They just say it band limits. And then they say, try to use this instead of this later on at the very end, where they give some tips and stuff near the end. It's like, these are worlds apart. Like, this hardly ever makes a difference. So I mean, you could try it, but we could band limit. This is going to be the one that needs to be band limited. If I play an even higher signal. If I get too high, I lose my signal. There's a bigger difference. So as you can see, but then I could just turn on oversampling to like 4. That makes a huge difference. So oversampling is a way more powerful tool because I'm not sure how they're limiting it. And if you've watched my, again, digital audio series on oversampling, you'll know the process that this does, and it's so different. So yeah, so okay, that's what those do. Now on to the last few things. So I'm going to take this. If you hold down Alt and click, it'll reset it. I'm going to make this, I'm going to leave it a triangle wave just so we have some harmonic content to work with. So, all right, now what does pluck do? That's what pluck does. It simply applies a dampening filter so your higher harmonics roll off faster and your lower ones ring out longer. Now, there's one thing I wish they would change. Maybe they can make it like a red outline or something, but when you do this, you cannot FM things. You can still ring modulate, I believe. Yeah, you can still ring modulate, but you can't FM, and it turns a darker gray. This is something that it should turn red. It should turn something that says you can't FM this right now. So they'll turn dark gray saying that these options are not available. Let me turn it on and off. I don't know if I can barely see that, and I'm looking at it from my computer. So again, I wish that would like turn red or something. So with pluck on though, it'll apply that filter. So you can't FM with that, but it's a nifty feature. You can accomplish the same thing simply by doing volume automation and engaging a filter later on if that's something that you would like to do, but still use it as a modulator. So, okay, so that's pluck. Now, what is this phase deal? Now, phase, let me, whoops. Okay, so phase. What's the deal with phase? All right, phase is, you know, go watch Sound Synth Basics 5. That's phase. So we can control the starting point and line up our phase using this where they start. But let's say that we've got multiple voices going. Now, if you don't understand this, don't worry about it too much. But we have in the main, we've got this unison. I'm going to cover this later. And I can turn it on so that each operator will now have its own 5 voices. And I can control each of these voices individually using the unison control. You see I have 1, 2, 3, 4. And then there's the original 5th voice, which is the timbre that it is. So if we go down to 1, that's the lowest you can go because that's how many there are. And this will generate more voices. So it's essentially like there's like now, how many do I have right now? I have 2 plus the original. So I've got 3 voices for this one oscillator. And I get a sort of a cool sound, and we're gonna talk about what this is doing exactly because this is a CPU monster. But you can control the phase of the individual waves of all those different voices. So this controls the phase for this one operator, and you can move them around. If you hit global, this changes it so that all the different voices that are sounding are all synced up. It doesn't sync up operator 3, 4, 5, and 6, or 2. It doesn't sync up all the other oscillators to this one. It syncs up all the voices to be in so they all start at the same point, so you can get a consistent attack. If I turn it off, you can hear a difference. This can become a huge deal on certain percussive attacks and things. So this phase global relationship here is mega important, very useful. All right, so there's only 2 more knobs here, and I'm going to cover that because this has been kind of a long tutorial. So we have volume, and that controls, it's essentially the same thing as the volume inside here. So it's a little strange. So if I turn the volume off, it's like I'm controlling this knob, but if I'm using it as a modulator, let's say I'm doing 2, is modulating 1. If I move this knob, it's like I'm controlling that. So, okay, well, this is going out, it's a little confusing. It's like I'm controlling just this knob, and it's moving this up or down, but this controls the FM amount. And as a modulator, that's the only parameter that's relevant. So this sort of plays double duty, but when it's going out, it doesn't do anything because this sets the limit. So this can only be 0, but this can be something else. But if I set this all the way up, oops, I'm moving 2. Okay. As you can see, I could turn the volume off and the modulation off at the same time. There's a way to change just this knob using a variety of other parameters that we have in here, like the volume. Well, volume not necessarily, but maybe modulator could let us get at that. So there are other ways to affect the knob individually. But just so you know, this knob is a little confusing, even though it seems straightforward as a volume knob, because it controls both this and that, both the major output and the FM. But this FM will set a limit. So When you get into FM, this can become a relationship that you really need to understand for Sytrus specifically, not necessarily a problem in other plugins. So that's that. And then we have this last thing for PE. It stands for pitch envelope. So we can have a pitch bend. So if I turn on a pitch bend envelope, which we'll talk about this later, but I can set that up. I can set the minimum and maximum value, which is what this does. So I can make it way bigger, or I can make it really small. And you could see your exact setting over here in the menu when you move it. So you could set the minimum and maximum that allow for your pitch bend relative to your envelope. And we're going to talk about envelopes and stuff, probably bring that knob back up again later. I don't know. So yeah, I hope you understood this. I hope it was useful. Now let's really quick just create a cool sort of tone using just various sine waves and waveforms. So we'll go 3, output 3. I'm going to turn unison off because we haven't talked about it. So right now I'm going to make it off limits. And we could do something like this. And now I'm going to turn oversampling on, even though I haven't really talked about it. But I like oversampling on. This can become, again, bothersome when you have a lot of things going. So you may consider just working with the aliasing. But even with just the waveform, the nature of this plugin just screams, I need oversampling. See really fast, we can create a really interesting thing. I haven't talked about pitch yet either, so I can't really create that crazy of a thing. But you can get all your 8-bit textures out of here, easy peasy. Just start doing that and do some 8-bit stuff. If you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe and have a blessed day.
Reversing.